Hello, Uplanders. I've done some really interesting analysis here, taking a look at the different cities that are in Upland and how they compare to themselves, and I wanted to share that with you today. I'm YK2012, founder of the Upland Guide. Starting out with this graph here, we can see that every single line here represents a different city. On the x-axis, I have ranked all of the neighborhoods of each city based on their initial price. So the most expensive neighborhood would be ranked number 1, and the least expensive neighborhood would be ranked last. From this, we can also see how many neighborhoods each city has. On the y-axis, we are looking at neighborhood value, and that is a calculation based on this property card of the initial purchase price divided by the up squared size. So we're looking at how much does each up square cost in that neighborhood. And they vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. So just looking quickly at this graph, we can see a couple of things that jump out. This short line right here is the city of Fresno, which is the second city to be released in Upland, and we can see that its prices per up squared are the cheapest all across the board. This city here is Kansas City, and we can see that it has the most number of neighborhoods, and you can't see it underneath my face, but there's 250 neighborhoods in Kansas City. And this line here is Manhattan, and we can see that its rise in neighborhood value is extremely steep. This graph actually continues to go up, but I've zoomed in here to get a little bit of a better view of what we can see here. Now, this is the graph that I started with, and I just see that there's way too much clutter. So I have taken this data and I have created some other graphs that show things in a little bit of a different manner. Before I move on to the next graph, there are a couple of terms that I want to explain and visualize because they're used in the next graphs. The first one is the median. I'm looking here at the median neighborhood value. So when I'm looking at a line like this for Kansas City, I'm not interested per se in the most expensive neighborhood, and I'm also not interested in the least expensive neighborhood. I want to look at the neighborhood that is ranked right in the middle. So if there's 250 neighborhoods in Kansas City, I want to look at the neighborhood value of this one here at 125, and this neighborhood value is 123. So by ranking all the neighborhoods in terms of their value, I'm heading to the middle neighborhood, and I want to know how much that costs per up squared. So for Kansas City, it's 123. For Manhattan, it's obviously going to be a lot higher. There are only 50 neighborhoods, so the 25th neighborhood is sitting at around 830 UpX per up squared. The second term that I'm going to explain, I'm going to use the city of Detroit as an example, and I want to know what the interquartile range is for these neighborhood values. So I don't want to look at the most expensive neighborhoods, and I also don't want to look at the cheapest neighborhoods. So what I'm going to do is take out the top 25% of neighborhoods and the bottom 25% of neighborhoods. So since there's approximately 200 neighborhoods in Detroit, I'm going to ignore all of the first 50 neighborhoods, and I'm going to ignore the last 50 neighborhoods. And we can see here that at the 50th neighborhood, we're looking at a neighborhood value of 128, and the 150th, we're looking at a neighborhood value of 68, and that is a difference of 60. So that can give me a good indication of how much change there is in the majority of the neighborhoods in a specific city. So onto this graph here, what I'm doing now is I'm taking a look at the total number of properties in the city on the x-axis, and I'm comparing that with the median neighborhood value. So that we said is the neighborhood that is ranked in the middle of the city, and what that base price neighborhood value is per up squared. I just want to point out that regarding the city of Porto, this video was created prior to the release of the additional neighborhoods. So we know that, so we can expect this data point to move a little bit to the right. And right away on this graph, we can see here, Los Angeles is the city that clearly has the most properties. Chicago is not that far behind it. Manhattan's median base price is much, much higher than every other city in Upland. And we can see here that Fresno, Bakersfield, and Staten Island, which are all tier 3 cities, have the lowest starting prices. And Rutherford is the city with the smallest number of properties. When a new city is announced to enter Upland, With the help of this blue ellipse, we can say with a confidence level of 95% that the new city will fall somewhere within this ellipse. So this goes to show, which is something that I think everybody who is familiar with Upland intuitively knows, is that Los Angeles and Manhattan are both outliers. As I mentioned a minute ago, Manhattan in terms of the prices and Los Angeles in terms of its sheer size, with Chicago not far behind. A number of other interesting things that jumped out to me was, first of all, the price of Santa Clara being quite high, and that is partially due to the fact that the release of that city was a standard release and not a vanilla release. We can see here San Francisco is actually quite in the middle of the pack here in terms of the number of properties as well as the median neighborhood value. And next I have highlighted here the 5 different boroughs in New York in addition to Rutherford, and we can see here in terms of the total number of properties and the median values that it's quite spaced out. And if you were able to mint properties in any of these releases, that you were able to find something for everybody. In this next graph here, we're looking at the median neighborhood value on the x-axis, which was previously on the y-axis. And now on the y-axis, we're looking at this interquartile range. The size of each dot represents how many properties there are in that city. So here we can see Los Angeles with the largest dot, meaning that it is the city with the largest number of properties. So here again, if we're looking at Manhattan and Los Angeles, we know that there is a very large gap in terms of the cheaper, more affordable neighborhoods and the more expensive neighborhoods. That is indicated based on the y-axis of it being so high. And we saw earlier that the median neighborhood value of Manhattan is just completely off the charts. Now I've zoomed in a lot more to take out both Manhattan and Los Angeles to get a better view of the rest of the cities in Upland. Here, a few things that I found interesting are the 2 international cities that have been released, Rio de Janeiro and Porto. And as I mentioned before, there is an expansion to Porto, which I have not included here, but I cannot imagine that the median neighborhood value moving quite a lot, and also the prices of those neighborhoods to be relatively similar. So I don't see this data point moving substantially, and it's still very interesting to see that it is one of the more expensive cities based on the neighborhood value. And here I've highlighted the cities that are still not sold out, where you can buy properties. You do have a range of cities from Detroit being your cheaper end, and all the way up to Queens and Las Vegas being more expensive in terms of the base prices. If you're looking at actual mint prices, you're probably going to see that the Las Vegas properties are much, much more expensive, and that's likely because the size of those lots are quite large. Again, we're looking at the base price per up squared. So with a lot of up squared in these Las Vegas properties, you're going to expect a lot higher mints. We also know that despite Las Vegas having quite a few number of properties right now compared to some of these other cities, we do know that Upland has announced that they did not release all of the neighborhoods of Las Vegas, so at some point in time in the future, there will be an expansion to that city. Fresno, Bakersfield, Staten Island, and Detroit were all advertised as starter cities, and there's still properties available in Detroit. These 3 cheapest cities were some of the earlier cities that were released in Upland, and it's interesting to see that Detroit is quite a large city that was released, and it's still advertised as a starter city, being one of the cheaper ones. But based on its relatively higher interquartile range, this means that there are quite a lot of areas in Detroit that are more expensive, and a number of areas in Detroit that are very, very cheap. So if you're looking at the middle of these pack neighborhoods, it seems to be quite on par with some of these other cities in Upland. Now, if we return back to this initial graph that I was looking at, with all the information that we've learned, we can start to make a little bit more sense of what we see here. Again, if we look at Manhattan, we can see that the neighborhood value prices just increase quite rapidly. And there is quite a steep rise when you take out the most expensive neighborhoods and the least expensive neighborhoods. Here, with the city of Los Angeles, you also see quite a steady increase in the base prices. You have very few properties that are on the lower end and a lot of neighborhoods on the higher end. I talked about Detroit, a city with a lot of neighborhoods and starting out quite cheap, and we can see it gradually increasing, with there actually being quite a number of neighborhoods here that are fairly expensive compared to the rest of the city. I didn't speak about Oakland, and here we can see there are quite a lot of neighborhoods that are in fact quite cheap, and then you start to see a steady rise, and there are quite a few properties that are extremely expensive. Oakland was one of the first cities to be released, and it was also in standard mode, so that is one of the causes of some of these higher prices in the most expensive neighborhoods. I hope you found this analysis insightful. If you saw something that's interesting, leave me a note in the comments, anything that I missed. If there's some sort of analysis that you want to look into or you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below or jump in my Discord server and let's open up a discussion about these graphs over there. The graphs that you saw can also be found in a link in the description below on the Upland Guide website.